even said howdy yet. Howdy. Thank you. Good morning and welcome. I hope you all are as excited as we've been for this visit. As I was sharing with the students at breakfast this morning, this is an event that's nearly 3 years in the making, which would be a big win on IODP expedition standards. But it is our absolute thrill and pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest this morning, Dr. MARCIA McNutt. I hope every other person who's had to introduce you has struggled as mightily as I have to find the words worthy of your career and path and everything you've done for science. So I'm going to give it my best. Dr. McNutt is one of the most brilliant scientists and one of the most gifted ambassadors for all of science the nation has ever known, period.
Hear, hear.
But through her accomplishments that have advanced global understanding of critical geophysical processes, and through her path into and through critical leadership roles, Dr. McNutt has advanced the cause of equity and diversity in science and has empowered a generation to pursue careers not just in geosciences, but in all the sciences. We are forever in your debt. Trailblazer doesn't even come close to capturing the magnitude of what Dr. MARCIA McNutt has accomplished, but here are a few vital stats in case you need a primer on her biography. Of course, in 2016, she was elected president of the National Academy of Sciences. In 2013, was appointed editor-in-chief of Science Journal. 2009, was appointed by President Obama as the director of the United States Geological Survey. From 1997 to 2009, she served as the president and CEO of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And during that time period, she also served as the president of the American Geophysical Union from 2000 to 2002. Okay, there's more, bear with me. She's elected as a foreign member of the Royal Society, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, the Geological Society of America, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the International Association of Geodesy. And as I shared with the students, one of the most impressive accomplishments from a scientific standpoint in all of this decorated history is the fact that she was a McElwain Medal winner from the American Geophysical Union in 1988, which is the medal recognizing early career excellence and career promise. So, and then of course in 2007, she was the recipient of the Maurice Ewing Medal from the AGU. Do you ever tire of hearing this last name? We are honored and grateful for your visit. I'm very eager to hear your thoughts this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to visit us. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, thank you, Debbie. That was a absolutely over-the-top introduction. I think I should just say thank you and sit down now because I'm not sure there's anything more that I can say after that. Actually, I am the one who is honored to be here today at A&M. This is not my first visit here. Back in the Pleistocene, I was actually doing a lot of interesting work with the ocean drilling program. So got chances to visit here on various committees and workshops and things like that. But I have to say, this place has changed. You know, it was kind of a sleepy little town last time I was here, and now you've really kind of spiffed up the place, and it's, yeah, I mean, College Station is a happening place now, so wow, yeah. Anyway, it's great to be back. I'm really honored to be here as a honorary degree recipient, and I'm pleased to be talking to you today about one of my favorite topics, and that is the National Academy of Sciences, and more broadly, the topic of how science can serve society by helping to make better decisions. And let me tell you a little bit about my own personal journey in that sort of vein. I remember that for many years, decades even, I was a scientist working with my own postdocs and students, going to sea, collecting data, writing papers that maybe a handful of people honestly really cared about, that they would read, that they would build upon, that they felt were providing new insight onto what to most of America really looked like esoteric issues about the deep earth and fundamental things going on that were beyond actually the daily lives of absolutely everyone in this country. And it wasn't until I was asked to become director of the USGS that I realized how important it was, all the science that was being done at the USGS that short-circuited that kind of trickle-down method that, as an academic, one would hope that ultimately that basic research would ultimately lead to something practical. But here at the USGS, it was being short-circuited, that there was scientific work that was being done that was of practical import every day to people in this country. Where are they going to get clean water? How are they going to be safe from natural hazards? Where are they going to get the critical minerals for society? How are they going to prevent invasive species from harming ecosystems that provide the basic natural support for our quality of life? And here at the National Academy, I feel like it's an obvious extension of what we were doing, because what we do at the Academy is we work with all our members around the country and other volunteers to take the science that they have in their minds, the science they know well, the science they are doing in their labs, and figure out how does that apply to problems that people have every day. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. So, how does sound scientific evidence make its way into government decisions? So here's just a picture of US Congress, and clearly they have to make important decisions every day through legislation and in other ways, and one would hope that science can help guide those decisions. Now, does anyone want to guess how many of those senators and congressmen are scientists? How many are scientists? Yeah, okay.
Well, I think there are.
One. Okay, so clearly we can't expect, and you know, there are lots of lawyers and lots of businessmen. So clearly we don't actually need the American Business Council or the American Law Association to be advising them on a day-to-day basis about how to make laws that are supportive of American business or that stay within the framework of our legal system, because they know that. They got that covered. But for science, it's a different matter, because this is not something that is in their bailiwick. Okay, so where did the National Academy of Sciences come from? So many of you may remember from your American history that there was a famous battle during the Civil War between the first two ironclad warships. The Monitor, which was the the Union warship, and the Merrimack that was the Confederate warship. They fought in Chesapeake Bay, called the Battle of Hampton Roads. And because they were ironclad, the cannonballs just bounced off the sides of these two warships. And the two warships fought to a draw. So the news of this battle made its way back to the Capitol, and Lincoln immediately thought, wow, the entire history of naval warfare has just been changed. In fact, when news of this battle made its way to the continent, all construction of wooden warships stopped in its tracks, and another wooden warship was not built. They all started becoming ironclads. And Lincoln said to himself, the future of naval warfare is in having the best technology. And he said, and I want the scientists on my side. So Congress was going into recess that night. And so he got a bill through Congress to establish the National Academy of Sciences. It would be a non-governmental organization. It would be self-perpetuating by electing its own members. But the mission of the National Academy would be to provide advice to the nation whenever asked. So that is how the National Academy came to be. During the Civil War, advisors to the nation, it selects its own members, but and it is a non-governmental entity. Oops. So, I should say, so does anyone want to guess what the first request from the government was to the Academy? It was, how do you navigate an ironclad warship? Because none of the magnetic compasses worked. And so the National Academy figured out magnetic shielding. It was the first application of magnetic shielding so that they could navigate an ironclad warship. So that was the first job. All right. Now, throughout the years, the Academy had a number of firsts. For example, one of the early recommendations from the National Academy was to establish the U.S. Geological Survey. We might not have a USGS had it not come from the National Academy. Another suggestion from the Academy was to establish a National Park Service. There actually had been a couple parks established. Teddy Roosevelt had suggested setting aside lands for national parks, but no one was in charge of it. And so the Academy said, you need a government organization with stewardship over these special places, because if you don't, they will not remain special places. So the National Park Service also came to be as a result of the recommendation of the National Academy. Now, unfortunately, the advice of the Academy is not always taken. So here's an example. The Spanish flu. 1918 to 1919, a highly contagious disease was making its way around the world. The government came to the Academy asking for advice. What can we do immediately to stop the death toll from the Spanish flu? The Academy recommended, don't house your troops in close quarters. You are just creating the exact conditions for this epidemic. the military rejected the recommendation. They said, we're the military. We put our people in barracks. This is what we do. And they refused to even take the sick people and move them someplace else. The end result was that the flu affected 20 to 40% of US troops, and more US servicemen died from the flu than from enemy fire. So, ignoring science does come with a price. Okay, but there are better stories. There are a few people in this audience, just a few. How many of you remember flying on airplanes when there was a smoking section? Yeah, okay. So I remember the days when smokers sat in the back of the plane and non-smokers sat in the front of the plane. And okay, so then the medical community started raising red flags about secondhand smoke. And because the air on these airplanes is all recirculated, having a smoking section and a non-smoking section, of course, made no difference because everyone's breathing the same air. So, health advocates said to the CDC and the FDA and to the Transportation Agency, they said, you know, we really shouldn't have people smoking on airplanes at all because everyone's just breathing secondhand smoke. So the government wisely turned to the academy and said, we'd like you to look at this issue and make some recommendations about whether smoking should be banned on airplanes. So the academy, in its wisdom, decided, okay, we'll have on this committee looking at this problem, we'll have not only people who know public health, but also people who know something about the circulation of air in airplanes and people who know something about aircraft engineering, and also people who know something about the sociology of policy changes, et cetera. So it was a widely constituted committee. Well, the committee got together and considered what to do and agreed that everyone was breathing this smoke. But they also found out something unexpected. And that is that back at this time, which was in the 70s, early 70s, I think it was, or mid 70s, the quality control in the passenger compartment of the aircraft was not what it is today. And that during flight, pinprick holes would develop in the passenger compartment that were only being sealed by the tar and nicotine from cigarettes, and that if one were to ban smoking all at once, it would cause depressurization of the passenger compartment. So, the Academy recommended a phased banning of smoking on flights in order to give, first of all, smokers a chance to adjust to the fact that on the long-haul flights, they wouldn't have a chance to smoke because, of course, many of them were hooked on the nicotine, but also in order to give airline manufacturers an opportunity to find a solution to the pinprick holes so that they wouldn't lose pressurization on the flights. So after a few years, so it started with banning smoking on the short flights. After a few years, they were able to ban smoking on all flights, and now we all fly smoke-free while still breathing, which is a good thing. All right. So another study I wanted to highlight for you was one that happened in 1986. And the reason why this study was significant is at the time, this study raised awareness about HIV/AIDS. And the US government's position at the time, and it's really hard if you didn't live during that era to imagine how ignorant so many people could have been about this problem. But at the time, AIDS was mostly confined to the intravenous drug community and the gay community. The position of the federal government at that time was they weren't going to do much about it. They just weren't going to do much. So the Academy, with its own funding, without actually even being asked by the government, did a study and determined that this had the potential to become a public health epidemic, that there was nothing about the disease that said that it would be confined to these two groups, the drug community and the gay community, that it could spread throughout the entire population unless the government took immediate steps to protect the blood supply, to do a needle sharing program so that addicts weren't sharing needles and therefore sharing the disease, and to start a program to develop treatments and cures for HIV. This report was significant because it was accepted by the Reagan administration in all of its recommendations, and all of those things happened. And this was from a president who said, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And yet he took all those recommendations and made them happen. And so in the United States, AIDS was actually brought under control. Treatments were found, cures have been implemented, the disease was halted in its tracks. And in other nations, if you looked at the life expectancy in countries like South Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, in the 1980s, life expectancy curve started plummeting because of AIDS. And life expectancy, which had been on the rise, turned over, and the average population started dying earlier because they did not bring AIDS under control. So this was a very important report, and the fact that the government seized on it was very important. Here's another important study from the 1980s. This is another report that the Academy just decided to do. No one asked us to do it. And the Academy asked the question, what might be the impact of sequencing the human genome? And the report came out with a recommendation for a national effort to sequence the human genome. Given the technology at the time, which was so rudimentary compared to what it is now. I mean, any of us can send in a cheek swab and get our genomic results back now. At the time, it was a moonshot. It was a moonshot to sequence the human genome. And the report said the payoff would be, and it listed the things that would come. Well, as we all know, the payoff now to the economy, just the Broad Institute alone has something like 16 companies that are more than $10 billion that have come out of that institute. So, the payoff in terms of the economy, in sequencing technology, human health, et cetera, have been immense. So this was a report that certainly launched a new era in medical technology as well as cures. Another report that I wanted to mention for a number of reasons was Rising Above the Gathering Storm. Are there people here, is there anyone here who has not heard of this report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm? Yeah, a couple people. Okay, so Rising Above the Gathering Storm was a report that was important because it discussed how critical it is for America to maintain a competitive edge in its basic R&D capacity. And it made the case for investing in research for American competitiveness, and competitiveness on an international stage. And it resulted in the adoption of the American Competes Act and the creation of ARPA-E. The American Competes Act is an act that has led to increases in funding for a number of basic science agencies that fund much of the research at our universities. But basically this idea that federal government investment is critical to the innovation machine, which is critical to our national competitiveness, our national security, and our economy, was made in this report. The key thing about it is not just the arguments that were made here, but who made it? Who made it? And very often with an Academy report, it's not just what the Academy says, but it's who says it. And in this case, the chief spokesperson for the report was the committee chair, Norm Augustine. Norm Augustine had been the CEO of Lockheed Martin. And the fact that he was a respected industrialist who was willing to stand up before Congress and said, industry in this country needs the federal government to invest in basic science, was very important. And that's so much more important than any of you standing up before Congress saying Congress needs to invest in basic research at universities. When it comes from someone in industry saying that, it carries so much more weight. So that's why we put extra effort in not only what we say, but who's saying it. Okay, this report was one that, how shall I say this? Totally disappointed our sponsor and was probably one of the most downloaded reports of all time. So this report was commissioned by the Justice Department because they wanted an analysis of what's the science behind forensic science. And the committee that was assembled concluded that with the exception of DNA, which is the gold standard for actually being able to say we've got statistics, we've got strong data. If you have this quality of DNA and you have this kind of match, we can say statistically what are the chances that this wasn't the perpetrator. You know, we can put probabilities on things. With the exception of DNA, there is no science in any other forensic science. So, you know, a good example is they went in and they looked at hair analysis. So you got a hair at the scene, and you arrest this guy, and you say, oh, look, take a hair from him, look at this hair at the scene, looks like the same hair color, looks like the same hair thickness. So we're going to convict this guy based on the hair analysis. Well, scientists went back after DNA was perfected and looked at all the cases where there actually was a root to the hair so that they could get some DNA off the hair. And they checked with the DNA of the guy who had been convicted. And they found in only 6 out of 10 times had they gotten the right guy. So that's a 40% false alarm rate of the wrong person being convicted. Now that is, in my view, a really bad case, because obviously there was some reason why that person was picked up anyway. You know, probably they had motive, they had means, they had opportunity or whatever. But when 40% of the time, even the person with motive, means, and opportunity is not a match to the hair, that tells you something's really wrong. So anyway, what has been the result of this report? Well, you know, eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony. Well, let's hope none of you are ever in court where someone says, "Oh yeah, it was her," because that's really bad. So, 3,000 death row inmates are now having their convictions re-examined based on this report. This report is on the shelf of every public prosecutor and on every public defender. Now, why did the Justice Department not like it? Well, of these thousands of people who are having their cases re-examined, probably many of them are guilty. So, of course, the Justice Department doesn't like it. So the Academy set up a independent commission to try to take some of these other forensic measures that don't have good science behind them and put good science behind them. How much of a fingerprint do you need to get a good match? How often do fingerprints match when it's not from the same person? That sort of thing, to get good science and good statistics behind it. And that commission was doing its work when it was canceled under the current administration, which is too bad because they were making progress. So this is one area where much better science is badly needed. Let's see. America's energy future. This was a series of reports, actually, that laid out a roadmap for achieving a low-carbon energy independence for the nation. And it talked about all that was needed in terms of technology, but also transformation in terms of grid, in terms of storage, et cetera, and the social aspects of it as well. A number of very meaty, difficult topics. It identified challenges and research needs that require public and private investment. Not surprisingly, the low-hanging fruit, energy efficiency. There is so much that could be done to reduce the carbon footprint of this nation just by energy efficiency. In buildings, one of the worst offenders for energy efficiency are our buildings, which are sieves for energy. So there's a lot that could be done just right there. Confronting the obesity epidemic. This is one that always startled me because of the tagline for this one. More people die today of too much food than not enough. That is worldwide. We're not talking about the US. Worldwide, more people die of overeating than undereating. And that's because of all of the diseases that are linked to obesity. Now just think of that. When you think of all of the co-benefits that would come from confronting obesity, the co-benefits in terms of reducing healthcare costs, reducing wasted food, reducing improving quality of life for people, etc. They estimated the cost to the US in entirely preventable disease and disability from obesity in this report, and the problem's only getting worse. It led to sweeping changes and pending policy legislative actions, many of which were put on hold in this administration, unfortunately. But the report is there and the recommendations still hold. Much of the work that we do at the Academy is either for the federal government or funded by nonprofit foundations. This one report is one that we did for states. And we actually did one on the Edwards Aquifer too, which was a state-funded report. This one we did for California, Oregon, and Washington, who were concerned about sea level rise and wanted better projections of what their sea level rise future looked like so that they could plan. And when you think about it, if you overestimate the rate of sea level rise, then you may abandon shoreline facilities before you need to. And so you're wasting money by moving SFO inland before it needs to be. If you underestimate the rate of sea level rise, then you aren't ready for it, and you've got a facility that is suddenly not useful, Long Beach Harbor, when it is still a major critical infrastructure that is now under threat. So getting this number right is really important. The report estimated sea level rise from ice melting, the ocean thermally expanding, and also groundwater extraction, which they found has been a major contribution, pulling groundwater out of the Ganges Basin, out of the Ogallala Aquifer, out of the San Joaquin, and the other major aquifers, is now a measurable contribution to sea level rise globally. Because you take it out of the ground and you're adding it to the ocean where it ultimately ends up. And the sea level rise will not be uniform. It's affected by ocean currents and plate tectonics, so there was a difference going from Washington to California in terms of the amount of sea level rise. And the tectonic effects will cause California south of Cape Mendocino to experience higher rates of sea level rise. And the sea level rise is going to be 1 to 1.5 meters by the year 2100. So that's a fairly significant rise to plan for in terms of existing infrastructure, major things like SFO and Long Beach. Now, the Academy also does reports that are inward-looking in terms of the academic community itself. And so this is one that was targeted at us, those of us in the room here. How can we maintain the trust of the public, of policymakers, by fostering integrity in research? And this report had recommendations for the journals we publish, for authors, and for institutions, et cetera, as to what we can do to make sure that we're doing the best to honor that trust that we've been given as scientists. For journals, it said, journals need to improve and update authorship policies to respond to threats and integrity. And it still talked about falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism as the three major breakdowns in integrity. But it also added a whole new category of detrimental research practices, which is well worth reading, because these detrimental research practices don't quite rise to the level of falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, but they still threaten the integrity of research. There are things like selling authorship on your paper to someone who you get your paper accepted to Science, and someone else is going to get a big bonus if they get a paper accepted in Science, so you sell an authorship slot. It's been done. It's been done. Or cutting someone out of authorship even when they deserve to be on it. That's a detrimental research practice. Or ghost authorship, where you've been funded by an industry group to do a study, and someone from that industry group ghost wrote the paper for you to give it a bias towards what that industry wanted to see as the answer, but you don't acknowledge that that happened. That's detrimental research practices. Policies should thwart these detrimental research practices, such as ghost authors or honorary authors. Honorary authors, that is where the head of the lab insists on always being a co-author, even though they know nothing about the research, they did nothing to deserve to be on the paper, they didn't write the research grant, et cetera, things like that. And the Academy is now thinking of setting up a research integrity advisory board to become an organizational focus for best practices and standards and help universities share best practices on what they can do. Okay, quick poll. How many of you are concerned about the safety of genetically modified foods? A couple people, okay. For that reason, I mean, in any other group of people, there would have been tons of hands going up, like tons of hands. Okay, so I went to the tack store the other day to buy a bag of alfalfa cubes for my horse. And here they have all these bags that say no GMOs in the alfalfa for my horse, as though like I'm going to be really concerned that there's GMOs in the alfalfa for my horse. So clearly there are a lot of people that are very concerned about this topic. So for this reason, the Academy decided they needed to look into this topic. So this was a 1916 report. And the reason why this report was important was there are a lot of people who weighed in on it, but it was the first report that actually did a synthesis of all the studies on the safety of GMOs. Now, it didn't look at the ethics. You can hate Monsanto's ethics, okay? I mean, I personally think that there's a lot of things they do as a business that I don't like. But this just looked at the safety of GMOs. And they screened all of the studies that have been done and put in one bucket anything that was funded by industry in the GMO business. They put in another bucket anything that was funded by an anti-GMO group. And then they had in the middle any studies that were funded by USDA or an independent nonprofit that didn't have a dog in the fight. And so the results that they came to were actually different than if you looked at all of the evidence. And so for that reason, I think that because they were just looking at the stuff that they felt had a good reason to be unbiased, because it wasn't funded by these people, it wasn't funded by these people, it was only funded by people who didn't have a stake in the outcome. So what they found was that they didn't find any evidence for harmful effects to health, but they also, but they found very little evidence that using the GMOs had huge impacts in terms of less insecticide use and reduced crop loss. In other words, many of the benefits that people were touting from GMOs were not being realized. So they felt that because the GMOs were being developed by the companies, they were actually being developed in order to maximize sales of the seeds for the companies. Roundup Ready corn, well, you can plant it sooner, but they didn't see that there were a lot of other benefits to it. So they said that greater benefits would be derived from public funding of GMOs, so that the GMOs are actually targeted at public benefits, not the benefits to the companies. But in terms of safety, they didn't see that there was anything wrong in terms of the safety, but they also didn't see, on the other hand, that the big benefits were really clear-cut. Okay, how am I doing time-wise? Well, I'm fine, okay, all right. We're getting to the end. Extreme weather and climate change. This is one that I think also has had a big impact. It's about climate attribution. And that is, I think a lot of climate scientists have struggled with the fact that if we wait until the worst impacts of climate change are really upon us, it may be too late because of this lag between when we release the CO2 and when we actually feel the impacts. There's a decadal lag between releasing CO2 and when we feel the impacts. So how do we communicate with people what are some more immediate impacts that they'll relate to? And one of them is weather. So what aspects of weather might be attributable to climate, and how do we message that? So this report that was chaired by David Titley, an admiral, said that there are aspects of extreme weather events that can be attributed to climate. The report said we can only discuss the events in a probabilistic sense. You can't say, for example, that Harvey was caused by climate change. But what you can say is that an event like Harvey was made X% more likely because of climate having been in a certain state due to climate change, because of the ocean having been warmer and the air having been warmer and more moisture having been available, etc. They looked at historical patterns and models for how climate actually influences the extreme events. The attribution for hurricanes was hampered by the quality of the record and ability to model. Therefore, they only put modest confidence based on an understanding of physical mechanism. But more heat in the atmosphere-ocean system can produce stronger storms and faster intensification. And that's what we've been seeing in many of these events. And certainly we've been seeing more droughts and heat waves. Immigration in the US. This has been probably one of our most influential reports of late, and the one that has been probably cherry-picked more by everyone from Breitbart News to the Huffington Post. And the reason for that is that immigration is not a simple topic. And of all of the outlets that cherry-picked these reports, I think the one that actually got it right, and you can tell when a reporter actually spends the time to read the report as opposed to word searching for phrases that match their preconceived notion. The one that got it right was actually the New York Times. Their coverage of it was actually on target. So there were two reports. The first one was on the integration of immigrants into American society. This report looked at the question of, we've had waves of immigrants. We had, the Germans and the Irish and the Scandinavians and Chinese, and we had people from Vietnam and Middle East and Mexico, many waves coming in. Each of them took a certain amount of time to integrate into American society, where they would adopt the language, where they would get into the education system, where they would infiltrate into the job market and the innovation system, et cetera. Often they would keep their religion, they would keep some of their customs, but there was a certain cadence for that. And so they asked the question, is that integration timescale changing today? So what do you want to guess? Is it taking longer? Is it taking shorter? Or is it unchanged? Who wants to say longer? No one. Who wants to say shorter? Who wants to say the same? Okay, ask the audience, you're always right. You're right. It's taking exactly the same amount of time. There's no change from the very first immigrants that came to this country till now. They integrate into American society at exactly the same rate. The only difference is the benefits they get from integration. The early immigrants, when they integrated into American society, they could expect better education and better health care. Now they don't. Their health care gets worse and their education gets worse compared to what they left. So that was interesting. The other one, the economic and fiscal consequences of immigration, said that over a 10-year period, the effect of immigration on wages is small, and negative effects are confined to the lowest wage earners. So it's generally those who do not have a high school education who are hurt by immigration. Those who have a high school or college or advanced degree are not hurt by immigration, and in fact are actually helped by it. The issue with this report is the following. The first generation of immigrants that come into this country are actually a drain on our system. We have to provide social services to educate them. We provide health services, et cetera, et cetera. However, their children and grandchildren pay back that investment many times over. So that is why immigration is a net benefit to the country. But the problem is the investment and the payback are not necessarily taken from and paid into the same accounts. Because where the immigrants come into the country can be in border regions and the payback is usually at the national level. So that is why immigration can be such a divisive issue in this country. That those who are bearing the burden of paying for the first generation are not necessarily those who are reaping the benefit of the payback of the second and third generation when it comes back to benefit us many times over. Okay, this one probably needs no introduction unless you were like buried in a cave last November. You probably heard about the story of the Chinese scientist who gave birth, who facilitated the birth of twins with their genome edited. The National Academy is continuing on this quest to improve the ethical control on editing the human genome. We're having actually a meeting next week in which we're convening top academies from around the world to consider how to tighten the controls so that there's no misunderstanding about what is allowed, what is not, what does informed consent look like before this type of editing takes place. Health effects of marijuana. Everyone seems to be very interested in this report. This seems to be like, ever since we put this one out, this has become our top report downloaded. I'm not sure I quite understand. So this one looked at the therapeutic value of marijuana and the health impacts of both short and long-term use. The difficult thing with this, in writing this report, was at the time that it was written, many states were just legalizing marijuana. So for that reason, there had not been a lot of controlled studies done on the therapeutic value or even the impacts of recreational use, because since it had all been illegal, no one wanted to publish studies that might get anyone into trouble. So what this report has really recommended is improvements in public health surveillance systems to monitor impacts of long-term use, now that it's all out in the open and real studies can be done. The report did do a lot of nuancing of which therapeutic values did there seem to be good evidence to say, yes, marijuana does seem to have real therapeutic value for this. This is maybe there, but it's kind of questionable. This there seems to be no evidence for, etc. One thing they did say was very understudied is the effect of recreational use of marijuana on the adolescent brain. And that is an area of some concern because with it being legalized, that will probably be one group that will be using it more and more, and without some understanding. We've just seen what the problems are of vaping, where vaping has taken over with young people in high school, and suddenly now huge health issues because there are toxic materials in those vaping products, and kids are going to the hospital because of them. So it was unregulated, uncontrolled, and now a dangerous product. So we just have to be careful about that. This is another very popular report just because of all the concerns about hacking of the power grid. You know, we saw it happen in the Ukraine, we've seen it happen elsewhere, and the report looks at strategies to increase resilience to events that cause large area, long duration outages, makes recommendations for improving the health and reliability of individual grid components, calls for better scenario planning rehearsals, and coordination, cooperation across response units. One of the things that is actually beneficial about our grid is the fact that it's got a lot of independent units. So if one part goes down, other parts can jump in and kind of fill in. But that can also be a disadvantage in terms of coordination of building resilience into it. But at least it doesn't have single points of failure. How many people have not seen this report on sexual harassment? Okay, this report came out last year. Yeah, last year. And really hit the nation by storm. We've probably had 3 congressional hearings on it. It's been written into legislation. We've set up an action collaborative with 60 to 70 universities that are working to implement it. The main graphic from it is shown here that tried to capture what the problem is with sexual harassment, in that saying it's kind of like an iceberg. Most people perceive the problem to be the part of the iceberg that they see above the waterline, whereas the real problem is everything below the waterline. That's what got the Titanic, of course, but because you don't see it, you don't really think about it, but yet this is the problem. So the part above the waterline is sexual assault, rape, groping, threatening professional consequences like quid pro quo. If you don't date me, I'm not going to sign off on your thesis or something like that. This kind of stuff is overt, out there, and so unimaginable and so awful that everyone says, of course that's ridiculous and no one would tolerate that. This kind of stuff happened when I was a student, but for the most part, policies have been put into place that you know, if anything like this happened, you could go to your dean or your department head or an ombudsperson and you could say someone did this and this would not be allowed. What happened though is after that all happened, this stuff kind of went away and everything went underground. A lot of stuff went underground. The iceberg didn't melt, but a lot of stuff went underground. So things like, oh honey, do you really want to be a scientist? Wouldn't you be really happier just maybe being an elementary school teacher, or maybe you just want to, you know, support your husband and what he's doing, you know? And they say it with in the nicest possible voice, like they're looking out for your welfare, you know, things like that. And so so a lot of this is just underground. And the report says that all of that is enabled by a perceived culture of tolerance, and unfortunately, all of the legal compliance is doing nothing to stop that. So we need to move beyond that legal compliance to change this culture. It requires transparency, accountability, diverse leadership, and support for the targets of this. We need to diffuse hierarchical relationships and measure progress. And so this has been a very important report. It started out as sexual harassment in academia, in science, medicine, and engineering, but the report has been used in all areas of academia and actually even in other areas as well. And then the opioid epidemic. We are doing so much work on this. 90 people die per day from opioid overdose, and the report makes recommendations on how to better understand the roots of addiction, how to stop the deaths, and to prevent addiction from occurring in the first place. And this has basically been a huge thrust recently for the Academy of dealing with this. And finally, this is my last one I wanted to talk about. So how many of you would really love it if you could just pick up your cell phone, put in a little code, and vote? Would that be easy? Would that be fun? Wouldn't we all have a much better turnout? All right, I agree. I would love to be able to do that. Okay, so the Academy was asked to look into the issue of could we come up with some wonderful way to do electronic voting? And the answer they came up with was use paper ballots. All right, use paper ballots. At the present time, the internet or any network connected to the internet should not be used for return of marked ballots. Further, internet voting should not be used in the future until and unless very robust guarantees of security and verifiability are developed and in place, as no known technology guarantees the secrecy, security, and verifiability of a marked ballot transmitted over the internet. They even said that the mechanical machines you use that aren't even connected to the internet, unless they leave a paper trail, you shouldn't use those. They have to have a paper backup. So why did they come to this conclusion? Well, in 2010, DC tried a pilot test. They selected 937 voters from the DC district to vote in their local election. And these 937 voters were sent a password and a login so that they could vote in the DC election electronically just to see if it would work, and everyone else had to come into their voting place. So this was like taking a red flag and holding it in front of a bull for all the hackers out there to figure out, okay, is this actually going to be secure? So a guy by the name of Alex Halbouty, who's a professor at the University of Michigan, and his students figured out, well, let's see if we can hack into the DC electronic voting thing. So they hacked in. They got the logins and passwords of these 937 voters who were allowed to vote electronically. And they not only changed their votes, but they changed the votes for everyone else who was voting too, such that instead of electing the guy who was running for, one of the people who was running for chair of city council, they got a write-in candidate elected, and the write-in candidate was Hal from 2001, Space Odyssey. The computer was elected. And to add insult to injury, every time their hackers changed a vote, the computer so first of all, it took 2 days for DC to figure out that they had been hacked. 2 days to figure out they had been hacked. And I'm wondering if their first clue was the fact that every time Michigan changed a vote, the computer in the DC district office played the Michigan fight song. Okay, and while they were in sort of rummaging around the DC ballot computer, they also found evidence that the Chinese were in there and the Iranians were in there as well. So that is why this recommendation is there. Okay, I started with an example of advice not being followed, and that was the Spanish flu. Well, here's another example. The Academy has lots of reports about the safety of vaccines and their effectiveness. We have them going back over many years, over and over again. They're safe, they're effective, there's nothing wrong with them. And yet, we still see measles outbreaks. So it's very important that science be used in making public policy. Because remember, science without policy is still science, but policy without science is gambling. So thank you very much.
robust conversation. So I'm sure Dr. McNutt would love to hear.
Happy to take questions, yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
I looked at one of your slides of sea level rising in 2012. You had a slide all the way back. It's interesting that you mentioned that plate tectonics was one of the causes of the sea level rise. I thought, what about climate? How do they fit together?
Okay, so plate tectonics is not one of the causes, but plate tectonics is one of the moderators of sea level rise, because you have at the Mendocino triple junction, you have a change from a transcurrent plate boundary to a subduction plate boundary. And so because of where you are in the seismic cycle, the you're likely to get a modulation of the sea level rise that's going to mean that California is still south of Mendocino is going to see more sea level rise than north of it, because it's sinking a little bit there that's going to offset the rise.
I'm so thrilled you worked geophysics into this.
Well, thanks for the good question. Oh. Yes?
Can you tell us more about how the National Academy reports are ordered, funded, and executed? Who does them?
Yes. Okay, so there are several ways that we go ahead and initiate a report and fund a report. The most common way for a report to be generated is that we have these boards at the Academy. So we have, for example, the board on Earth and Life Sciences. So the board on Earth and Life Sciences will meet a few times a year, and they'll think, what are the big problems that we should be addressing? And they'll make a list of what some of those big problems are that we might have to look at, like fracking might be a problem, like how could, what might be strategies that would allow for wastewater disposal without generating large numbers of earthquakes, that sort of thing. So then they would take that topic and they would go visit some of the relevant potential funders for a study on that. So they might go talk to the USGS, they might go talk to the Department of Energy, et cetera. And they would say, we think this is an issue, would you be interested in supporting a study on it? And then once they get some funders put together for it, then we launch a study on it, and we go around and we find smart people who know about the topic but don't have a direct conflict of interest because they aren't right now a company that does wastewater disposal or something like that, but they have maybe studied the problem or are broadly knowledgeable on the issue, and then we put the committee together and do it. And I would say that about 60% of our funding comes from the federal government. About 30% comes from private foundations, and about 10% we fund from our own endowment. So sometimes that's an entire study that we fund from our own endowment, or sometimes it's just maybe 10% of a study that we'll fund from our own endowment. Yes?
So you've talked a lot throughout your presentation about where your recommendations were either accepted or not used, which resulted in other problems down the line. And I'm just curious if you have any kind of data that you've collected on the diffusion of these reports and the actual impact in terms of policy adaptation or policy change.
Yeah. So that is a really great question. Really great question. That is exactly the question I asked when I first became president of the Academy. I said, where do I go to find some kind of database on what the impact has been of our reports? Well, basically what I found is that no one has been keeping track, and everything has been mostly anecdotal. So we are starting to change that at the Academy in the following way. We're asking our committees, as they deliver the report. So let's suppose we take this notional report on fracking. The committee that writes the report on fracking, before they disband, they would create a chart. And on their chart, they would say in the rows, who's the audience for our report? The audience may be, first of all, regulators who have control over wastewater disposal. So that might be EPA, might be state agencies. Another audience might be companies that actually have are responsible for actually disposing of the wastewater. So companies. Another audience might be agencies that are responsible for seismic safety. So USGS or other state geological surveys, et cetera. So they would put all the possible audiences for the report. Then they'd put in the columns possible actions that they would want any of those audiences to take based on the recommendations from the report. So they might want EPA to adopt some threshold on maximum volume of wastewater disposed in any one well. They might want drillers to minimize to adopt new methods to minimize the amount of fluids that need to be disposed by recycling or something like that. So they might have all sorts of things like that, and those might be then their suggested outcomes from the report. Then it would be easy to go back in 6 months, 9 months, a year, 2 years, and check the box. Did any of these things happen? And then see, and then you might have unexpected outcomes too. One of the outcomes might be state geological surveys note marked decrease in seismic activity. Yay, everyone wins, you know. So that would be a good example. Yes?
Leading on from that, you produced your report, identified all the players, and it's the wrong answer politically. What do you do?
Well, so.
Other than wait for a change in government.
Yeah. So one thing that we have found is that very often something that may not have traction with, I mean, there are a couple things we can do. One is we can wait, and then we can resurrect things later. Another thing we can do is we can find another route to it. So sometimes, like this, this immigration report, it actually is getting a lot of traction in states, even though it's not getting a lot of traction in the federal government. So I think that there's not always just one way to get things accomplished. And I think this, defining these audiences better, and maybe having the committee think seriously about not maybe putting all your ducks in one, or all your chits in one bucket, might be a good way to think about how you can maximize the possibility that you'll have some impact. Because I think a lot of our reports now are getting more action at the state level than at the federal level. Yes?
Are there any current studies that the Academy are sort of funded and in charge of that you are very excited about, or things that you would like the Academy to take on as sort of goal studies?
Oh, yeah, a lot. Gosh, it's sort of like asking me which of my children are my favorite. This is really tough. Let me just mention one that's a little bit different. Have any of you heard of a professor at Harvard named Raj Chetty? He's an economist, and he's helping us with something called the American Opportunity Study. And it's asking the question, is the American dream still alive? And is it still possible if someone, regardless of what circumstances they are born into, if someone just works hard and tries, that they can rise out of humble beginnings to achieve the American dream? And we're using, and this study is actually being facilitated by the fact that with big data, because now what we started doing was digitizing everything in the American census, going back decades, so that we can do a cross-correlation between things like where people were born, where they moved, what they achieved in life, and because everything's going online now, it's possible to track what happened to people. And this is really pretty exciting because it's showing, let me just give you one example from Raj looking at this. He did a study in Seattle and looking at the neighborhoods in Seattle. And he was looking at what difference does it make where you're born and where you grow up in Seattle. And he showed that let me back up a little. So if you were born in 1950, this is nationwide, if you're born in 1950, you had a 90% chance of exceeding your parents' income, 90%. So almost everyone ended up earning more than their parents in inflation and adjusted dollars. By 1990, that had dropped to almost 50%. So that it was a flip of the coin. Half people earned more, half people didn't. So it was kind of like, wow, what happened? That suddenly people weren't getting ahead anymore. So then he looked at this at Seattle, and he found neighborhood by neighborhood, it was very different. There were people in neighborhoods in this Seattle that were still 90%ers, and people in neighborhoods in Seattle that were 10%ers. So it all came out to be a 50%, but it depended on where in Seattle you lived. And what was interesting about it was he tracked people who moved from a 10% neighborhood to a 90% neighborhood and looked at what happened to the children. If the children moved before age like 9 or 8, they became 90%ers. If they moved from the 10% neighborhood to the 90% neighborhood, they became 90%ers. If they moved after age 13, they stayed 10%ers. And in the same family, if there were kids who were 13 and kids who were 5, the 5-year-olds became 10%ers, and the 5-year-olds became 90%ers, and the 13-year-olds stayed 10%ers in the same family.
Wow. I understand as well.
Yeah. So this is an amazing study. This is an amazing study. So I think it's going to tell us a lot about inequality in America. Yes?
So, I hope this might be standing on it. What would you, when one of these reports comes out that's relevant to something that we do, what is it that an audience like us should do to support or help disseminate that work? What's the things you'd like us to do that we take out of this other than just reading the results?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so, the Academy is trying to do more to support, all of you in the community, to help make sure that action gets taken. So I guess it sort of depends on what the topic is, but like, for example, with the sexual harassment report, we created this action collaborative. And so one thing you could do is say to your university, have you joined the action collaborative? Are we doing something effective here on campus to make sure we even the playing field so that everyone here can succeed, and that we aren't contributing to a leaky pipeline, and that that women feel supported, and we're changing the culture to be one that really encourages women to reach their full potential. So with each one, I think it's kind of different. I think ones that are like the fostering integrity in research one is another good example. That one has very specific recommendations about having conversations within your labs, within your departments, within your universities about what is the ethical conduct of research. One thing that I've been encouraging researchers to do is, when you start a project, sit down with everyone and say, this is what we consider the ethical conduct of this project, about the data, about how we treat our colleagues. This is what expectations are for authorship on this paper. If you want to earn authorship on this paper, this is what you have to contribute. And if you have a collaboration with people at another university, make sure you're on the same page. I'll tell you, there's nothing more divisive than to be collaborating with people at 2 universities, and the students at this university are told that they expect that they're all going to be co-authors on the paper, and the students at this university are told that they have not done enough to be co-authors on the paper. And then suddenly they all see the paper and all these students are on it and none of these are. That's a horror show waiting to happen. So you know, every report will be different, but you know, those are just some examples.
Before I whisk Dr. McNutt away to read Arena, we'd like to share with you a small token of our gratitude. So, but before I give you this, I wanted to share perhaps a more profound expression of our gratitude, which is a small glimpse into the impact you've had on not only us, but all of young scientists. So last week I was contacted by one of our early career faculty members who said he was, a family matter was taking him away and he wasn't able to attend the visit. And he said, yeah, Dr. McNutt's the reason I became a marine geophysicist.
Oh.
So I had to ask the story.
Yeah.
So he was an undergrad, still active duty Navy, and wondering what to do with the next step in his career, and his advisor and mentor handed him the profile on you. He thinks it was GSA Today.
Oh.
I was trying to find this.
Yeah.
And said, I think you might be interested in the science. And not only did Dr. Reese Dr. Reese he was thoroughly inspired by your work and the discipline, because at his small undergrad institution, this discipline wasn't represented on their faculty, just as so many of us encounter a broadening of opportunities at our grad institutions. And so not only did he apply to seek out graduate programs in marine geophysics, but he completed his senior thesis and was able to cite your work many times. But he asked if I could convey his gratitude to you, because he now in turn leads a lab group.
That's great.
And so in one fell swoop, you've now paid forward your impact through the education of dozens, if not hundreds, of students here at Texas A&M. And I
As
imagine,
others did for me. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
thank you.
Well,
And
thank
now,
you.
I'm going to open this for you.
All right.
Because isn't that the cool thing to do?
Yeah. Oh, whoa.
So we wanted to present you with a small piece of us to take back with you to DC.
Oh, wow.
Many of you, literally a piece of us, many of you might recognize
Look at
this as the
this.
same brecciated serpentine that lines the lobby of this building.
This is lovely.
I'm told this particular piece is not structural. Just to be safe, I'm going to ask everyone to, no, I'm just
This is gorgeous.
Thanks.
Thank
Let's
you.
do.
Yeah.
We probably have to get a.
Oh, we got to get a shot.
Wait,
Okay.
photo.
All right. Okay. All right.
Thank you
It's
so much.
beautiful.
Please join me once again in thanking Dr. McNutt.